So I'm going to speak today on the topic of hiring independent contractors. Look at the risks, look at some best practices around helping manage those risks. So to start, wanted to also talk to you a little bit about what the contingent workforce or the contract workforce is and why it's becoming a more important topic with a lot of organizations, and in particular with the risk groups within organizations and the HR groups within organizations. We'll look at the risks. The legislative risks we'll talk about in quite a lot of detail in the particular classifications of workers and stuff like that. The operational risks that you need to think about and manage with contingent workers, some of the benefits of centralizing this, ideally through a human resource function, and then potentially working through a third party. So there's a growing usage, and really it's a demographic shift of the workforce. You've got the baby boom generation that has been laid off, restructured a number of times, or if it worked out the way it was supposed to work out, they've got their 25 years of experience, they've got their gold watch, fully retired, go on their world vacation, golf for about 6 weeks and go, I want to get back to work. You also see a lot of employers now saying, we need you back. And so it's interesting, they're coming back to work, but they're coming back to work on their own terms, right? So, and that really lends itself to contract employment situations where the worker, the baby boom generation worker will say, hey, I want to work, the summer months, and then, I go down south for the winter months. On the other side of the generational spectrum is you have Gen Y. And I think it was IDC that had an interesting study that the Y generation actually has more loyalty to their brand of pop than to their employer, right? And if you've, in human resources, had to deal with the Gen Ys, you want to be CEO from the start. And so that demographic is also starting to sit in an organization for 2 to 3 years, get an itch, want to move, and have been sitting beside a consultant and said, well, how are you making your money? Like, you're sitting here working each day, I'm sitting here working each day, what do you get paid? And they're starting to learn about self-employment. So you're seeing both sides of that demographic really starting to look at contract workforce as a focus on. Everybody talks about legislative risk, and that's kind of the key reason why probably a lot of folks are here today, because it is complex and there's a need to get it right, or you're going to get into hot water with the various government authorities. But just as valid is the operational risk, specifically when you're dealing with industries where health and safety issues are a big play, and IP is very important to protect. There's a lot of operational things that you need to look at. So looking at the legislative risks, what are your liabilities, right? And I always call it misclassification liabilities, 9 times out of 10. That's what happens. So if you're classifying your workers properly as employees or self-employed workers, that's half the battle in mitigating your risks around the contingent workforce liabilities that are out there. So on the surface, everybody's afraid of the government entities, right? So in Canada, you've got the Ministry of Revenue in Ontario and Ministries of Revenue in the various provinces. You've got the federal CRA. Often it's not thought about is the workers' comp. And actually workers' compensation boards across Canada are being very vigilant these days on usage of contract workers, specifically in areas where there's heavy industrial component or manufacturing and that kind of thing. But even more so, they're looking for revenue to pay the premiums. And we've seen a lot of audits these days in the head office jobs, what I call them, which are marketing, IT, and those types of things as well, where you go, workers' comp. Why would an IT contract worker need workers' comp? Well, at the end of the day, if that person gets hurt on your site, if they're classified properly as an independent operator and self-employed, that's not a problem. If they don't have workers' comp though, then it becomes a question of classification. And often what you'll see is the worker compensation board starting to question the worker on, were you really self-employed or were you an employee? And if they're laid up and they need all these expenses, health and safety, health and safety, health and safety. Everyone in human resources, often when you hire full-time employees, it's just part of the package, right? They get the first week orientation, they get a health and safety binder, they usually get training, site-specific, job-specific, if needed. Contract workers sometimes just show up, right? In industrial settings, we're seeing more site-specific, job-specific training in some cases, but in a lot of cases, we don't see any. And this is where there's a gap we often see, and this is a huge risk, especially if they're in high-risk job positions and that kind of thing. From a business continuity risk, do you have the resources you need, right? And so there's been talk around succession planning and all that sort of stuff. It's exactly the same with contract workers. And in actual fact, an integrated approach of looking at the contingent workforce as a potential stopgap in your succession plans may be something you may want to think about and integrate into your overall talent management plans, succession plans, and these types of things. In total, who's getting the work done and how you're going to fill the gaps if needed. Loss of corporate knowledge, because these are mobile workers. Not to say that your full-time workers aren't mobile too, but these people are actually getting into the relationship to be mobile. So they're getting into it with an end date on their contract. So with your knowledge of that, how are you going to manage the knowledge, the transfer of knowledge, and all those types of things? And then physical and IP asset management. It's amazing when I look at a lot of organizations, how many laptops, security badges, all sorts of documentation stay with the contractor after they finish, right? When you really think about it, independent contractors versus employees are small businesses. And so you want to manage what is called the nature of relationship, i.e. how you interact each day with these workers that truly creates a separation between them and your organization and a true definition between an employee and a contractor. So setting up an engagement model that helps in that is really important. So things to consider from an employer consideration, should really look at their classification, their employment status, the various insurance coverages that you require to mitigate various risks, and that actually helps in the classification of the worker. As we'll see a little bit later on, if the worker has an investment in their business, and commercial insurances are that, then when tested from a government body standpoint, they'll pass, because what employee would have commercial liability insurance and have paid for that kind of thing? Tools of the trade and separation between on various, how it's interacted and disciplinary action between full-time and ICs. You can still have disciplinary actions and things like that, but it needs to be defined and it needs to be separate. And generally part of the terms and conditions of the contract with the contract worker versus governed under an Employment Standards Act or an employment contract per se. From a contractor consideration, they want to look at their tax structure, the risk, the tools of trade, and how to market their business in order to be on the right side. Low cost of startup, so a lot of people just do it. It's easy, you call up 1-800-CRA and you get your GST and in business for yourself. From an employer perspective, it's less expensive to administer, but it's your highest risk because it's self-employed. So your manager at an operation line level is getting an invoice from a sole proprietor. He does not know if that sole proprietor has done any of the remittances for him as an employee of that small business. And it's often more expensive to administer than incorporated consultants. Incorporation, this tends to be the preferential structure from a risk perspective solely if classification is proper, because it adds an additional layer of structure between you and the worker themselves, because as most people know, a corporation is a separate legal entity than the individual who actually owns the shares of that company. But you really have to work on the classification, administration, and understand, is that worker, if he is truly an independent operator, can he prove that in a court of law? So digging deeper than just saying, yeah, Joe, send me an invoice, have your contracts in place, get proofs of incorporated status, get proof of workers' comp accounts in good standing, are very important when you're looking at this status of a worker. Interesting thing. A lot of folks may say, well, we just have a staffing agency that takes care of that, or we have multiple staffing agencies that just take care of this stuff for us. In recent rulings, that recent audit and a number of these rulings, where an intermediary between the contractor and the client, they actually considered the client to be the person whom the services were provided, right? So that changes the dichotomy and this whole idea of I've mitigated my risk because I've pushed it over to a third party. So they really looked at the nature of relationship versus the contractual relationship. So another key point from the rulings was it follows a self-employed guideline. There's a number of factors that go into a ruling. They're examined individually and then weighted as a whole to get a ruling, right? So I always say, if you get 8 out of 10 on a test, you've passed, right? So the key is to have as many of these building blocks to prove independent status in your file as possible, right?